The moment you stop trying to feel better, you actually will. But nobody believes that at first, because everything in your life has trained you to do the opposite. Think about the last time you felt genuinely at peace, not distracted, not numbed out, not exhausted into stillness, actually at peace. For most people, that memory is hard to find. And when they do find it, it wasn't during a vacation they planned for months. It wasn't after hitting a goal they chased for years. It was a quiet Tuesday morning, a walk with no destination, a moment when, for no particular reason, the mind went silent. And then it ended, because you noticed it, and the moment you noticed it, you tried to hold it, and the moment you tried to hold it, it was gone. That is not a coincidence. That is the pattern, and understanding that pattern is what this entire video is about. Let's start at the beginning. You were born into a world with a very specific operating system installed in your mind. From the moment you were old enough to understand language, the message was consistent. If something feels bad, fix it. If something is wrong, correct it. If you're uncomfortable, make it stop. This makes sense on the surface. Pain is a signal. Discomfort alerts you to danger. The instinct to remove what hurts is deeply wired into human biology. It kept our ancestors alive. But here is where the system breaks down. There is a fundamental difference between physical pain and psychological discomfort. When your hand touches fire, pulling it away is the correct response. The threat is external. The action is mechanical. Problem solved. But when the discomfort is internal, when it's anxiety, self-doubt, frustration, loneliness, or the nagging sense that something is wrong with you, the same instinct does not produce the same result, because you can't pull your hand away from your own mind. And yet that is exactly what most people spend their entire lives trying to do. They try to outrun their thoughts through constant activity. They try to silence their emotions through distraction. They try to fix their inner world the same way they fix an object in the outer world. With force, with strategy, with relentless effort. And it doesn't work. Not because they're weak, not because something is wrong with them, but because the approach itself is fundamentally misaligned with how the mind actually operates. Modern psychology has a name for this. It's called experiential avoidance, the chronic attempt to suppress, escape from, or alter unwanted internal experiences. Thoughts, emotions, memories, physical sensations. Research from the field of acceptance and commitment therapy, developed by psychologist Stephen Hayes, consistently demonstrates that the more energy a person invests in avoiding internal discomfort, the more psychologically rigid and distressed they become over time. You are not solving the problem. You are teaching your nervous system that the problem is dangerous. And a nervous system that believes something is dangerous will keep sending alerts louder, more frequently, more urgently, until it is heard. The Stoics understood this over 2,000 years ago, not with fMRI machines and clinical studies, but through rigorous self-observation and philosophical discipline. Epictetus, born a slave in ancient Rome, wrote with striking clarity, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." That single line contains an entire psychological framework, one that modern science has spent decades catching up to. And today, we are going to go deep into it. Let me give you a demonstration right now. For the next 10 seconds, do not think about a white bear. Whatever you do, do not picture a white bear. You pictured it immediately, didn't you? This is not a parlor trick. This is one of the most replicated findings in cognitive psychology, first studied by researcher Daniel Wegner in the 1980s. He called it ironic process theory, the phenomenon where deliberate attempts to suppress a thought paradoxically increase its frequency and intensity. The mechanism is straightforward but counterintuitive. When you tell your mind not to think about something, your mind simultaneously has to keep that thing active in working memory as a reference point for what to avoid. In doing so, it creates a monitoring process that perpetually scans for the forbidden thought. The result? The thought keeps showing up. Now apply this to real life. You're lying in bed at night. An anxious thought arrives. You tell yourself, "Stop thinking about this. I need to sleep. This isn't helping. Think about something else." What happens? The anxiety intensifies. Your heart rate rises. Your mind races faster. The thought you tried to push away is now the loudest thing in the room. Or consider anger. Something happens during the day that frustrates you. You decide to suppress it, to be professional, to be calm, to not let it show. You force the emotion down, but it doesn't go anywhere. It sits just below the surface, bleeding into every subsequent interaction. And then something small and unrelated happens. Someone cuts you off in traffic, a minor inconvenience, and suddenly the suppressed frustration erupts disproportionately. This is not weakness. This is the predictable behavior of a nervous system under pressure. Neuroscience confirms that emotional suppression activates the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, and increases physiological stress responses. A study from Stanford University found that suppressing emotions not only fails to reduce distress, it actually increases the intensity of the emotional experience while simultaneously impairing memory and social functioning. You are not calming yourself by forcing emotions away. You are creating internal pressure with no release valve. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor of Rome and one of history's most disciplined minds, wrote privately in his journal what we now know as meditations, words that carry the weight of someone who truly understood this. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. He wasn't writing poetry, he was writing a discipline manual for his own mind. And what he recognized through years of observation was that resistance does not dissolve difficulty. Resistance transforms difficulty into identity. When you resist an emotion long enough, you stop experiencing it as a temporary state and start experiencing it as a permanent condition. I am an anxious person. I am an angry person. I am someone who can't handle this. You have taken a weather pattern and mistaken it for the climate. Here is the central insight of Stoic philosophy, and it is deceptively simple. There are things within your control, and there are things outside your control. That's it. That is the whole framework. The Stoics called this the dichotomy of control, and Epictetus placed it at the very foundation of his entire system of thought. In the opening lines of the Enchiridion, he wrote, "Some things are in our control and others not. Things in our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever are our own actions. Things not in our control are body, reputation, command, and, in one word, whatever are not our own actions." Read that again slowly. What is in your control? Your opinions, your judgments, your responses, the quality of attention you bring to any moment. What is not in your control? Other people's behavior, outcomes, the past, the body's initial physical sensations, the first flash of emotion that arises before conscious thought even engages. Here is where most people make a critical error. They treat emotions as if they fall entirely in the first category, as if they should be able to control exactly what they feel at all times through sheer willpower. And when they cannot, they interpret the failure of control as a moral failure, as weakness, as something wrong with them. This is not the Stoic view. The Stoics did not claim that a wise person feels nothing. They made a precise distinction between propathii, what they called first movements, the involuntary initial reactions that arise automatically, and the judgments that follow. The first flash of fear when a car swerves toward you is automatic. The spiral of anxiety about car accidents that consumes you for the next 3 days is a choice, a habit, really, but a chosen habit. You cannot control the first movement, but you can interrupt the story that follows it. This is not mysticism. This maps precisely onto what modern neuroscience knows about the brain's dual process architecture. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio's research on emotion and decision-making demonstrated that emotional signals arise before conscious processing. They are generated by subcortical structures operating below conscious awareness. The amygdala can trigger a stress response within milliseconds, long before the prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational thought and executive function, even registers what happened. You are not broken for having emotional reactions. You are biological. But the prefrontal cortex, when trained, when cultivated, when given the right tools, has the capacity to observe those reactions, evaluate their accuracy, and choose a response rather than simply executing a reflex. That gap between stimulus and response is where Stoic practice lives. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, articulated this with profound clarity. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. The Stoics would have recognized this immediately. The space Frankl describes is not passive. It is not simply waiting. It is an active, cultivated capacity, developed through daily practice, through rigorous self-examination, through the habit of observation. And it is available to you right now, today. Let's go deeper into the science, because understanding the mechanism makes the practice more accessible. When you experience a threatening situation, whether physical or psychological, your brain activates what's commonly known as the stress response. The amygdala fires. Cortisol and adrenaline flood the bloodstream. Heart rate increases. Attention narrows. The body prepares for fight or flight. This system evolved for survival. In acute, genuine danger, it is extraordinarily useful. The problem is that the modern human brain cannot reliably distinguish between a physical threat and a social or psychological one. An unanswered message from someone important to you activates many of the same neural pathways as a predator in your peripheral vision. A critical comment from a colleague can trigger a cortisol spike nearly identical to the one triggered by physical danger. The brain is running ancient software in a radically different environment. Now here is the critical piece. Research in effective neuroscience has demonstrated that when you label an emotional experience, when you name it explicitly, activity in the amygdala decreases. Psychologist Matthew Lieberman at UCLA conducted studies showing that putting feelings into words, a process he called affect labeling, reduces amygdala activation and increases prefrontal engagement. In simple terms, Naming what you feel takes neurological power away from the reactive part of your brain and gives it to the part of your brain capable of reasoning, perspective, and deliberate response. The Stoics, without access to neural imaging equipment, arrived at remarkably similar conclusions through pure introspection. Journaling, a central practice of Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus, is, in functional terms, exactly what Lieberman's research describes: the practice of translating raw emotional experience into structured language, which reorganizes the experience in the mind and reduces its disruptive charge. What the Stoics called self-examination, modern science calls cognitive reappraisal, deliberately changing the way you interpret an emotional experience by shifting its context or meaning. A 2012 meta-analysis published in Psychological Bulletin reviewed 48 studies on cognitive reappraisal and found it to be one of the most effective emotion regulation strategies available to humans, with downstream benefits including reduced negative affect, increased well-being, and stronger interpersonal relationships. This is not wishful thinking. This is measurable, reproducible, neurologically grounded. When Seneca wrote, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality," he was describing what psychology now calls catastrophizing, the cognitive habit of amplifying negative events beyond their actual significance. And his prescription to examine the judgment, not the event, is functionally identical to the process of cognitive reappraisal. 2,000 years of Stoic practice confirmed by modern neuroscience. Now let's talk about something that runs even deeper than emotional reactions. Let's talk about desire. There is a particular kind of suffering that most people never fully identify. It doesn't feel like pain. It feels like motivation. It feels like drive. But underneath it, if you're honest, it feels like lack. The feeling that where you are is not enough. That who you are is not enough. That the current moment, this moment, right now, is insufficient. And that fulfillment is perpetually located somewhere ahead, beyond the next achievement, the next milestone, the next version of yourself. This feeling is so common, so culturally normalized, that most people never question whether it is accurate. They assume it is simply the human condition. They assume that restlessness is the price of ambition. They assume that the nagging dissatisfaction they carry is evidence of something missing that, once found, will finally make everything complete. Seneca wrote, "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more that is poor." This is not a statement about material wealth. It is a precise psychological observation. The experience of poverty, of lack, of insufficiency is not determined by what you have. It is determined by the orientation of the mind. A mind that craves is a mind that perpetually experiences absence, because craving, by definition, is the experience of not having. And if craving becomes the default state of the mind, then not having becomes the default experience of life, regardless of what is actually present. Modern psychology has a sophisticated understanding of this dynamic. Self-determination theory, developed by Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, distinguishes between intrinsic motivation, action driven by inherent interest, meaning, or enjoyment, and extrinsic motivation, action driven by external rewards, validation, or the avoidance of punishment. Decades of research in this framework consistently show that when intrinsic motivation is replaced by extrinsic drivers, well-being decreases, not because achievement is bad, but because when your sense of sufficiency is anchored to outcomes outside your control, to recognition, to status, to others' approval, your inner equilibrium becomes entirely dependent on variables that life cannot reliably provide. This is the architecture of chronic dissatisfaction. You achieve the goal. There is a brief moment of satisfaction. Then the mind recalibrates. It raises the standard. It locates the next insufficiency, and the cycle continues. Behavioral economists call this hedonic adaptation, the well-documented tendency of humans to return to a relatively stable level of happiness shortly after positive or negative events. The research is consistent and slightly humbling. Lottery winners and newly married couples within 1 to 2 years report happiness levels remarkably similar to their baseline before the life-changing event. The external world cannot provide what the mind is actually looking for, not because the world is deficient, but because the mind is looking in the wrong direction. The Stoics did not say, you should not want things. They said, you should be radically clear about what category things fall into. Is this something within my control or outside it? Is this desire leading me toward genuine flourishing? Or is the mind mistaking absence for motivation? When desire is examined rather than blindly followed, when it is observed as a movement of the mind rather than obeyed as a command, it loses the compulsive quality that makes it exhausting. It becomes information rather than instruction, and the perpetual experience of lack begins quietly to dissolve. This brings us to what might be the most counterintuitive insight in this entire video. Releasing control makes you more effective, not less. This seems backwards. The culture we live in prizes control, control of outcomes, control of perception, control of how others see you. The person who appears to have everything under control is admired, trusted, elevated. And so we internalize this. We believe that the key to a successful life is the maximization of control over circumstances, over other people, over our own internal states. But look at what this actually produces. A person operating from a compulsive need for control is, paradoxically, being controlled. They cannot respond flexibly to changing circumstances because change threatens the control structure. They cannot receive feedback gracefully because feedback implies the control is imperfect. They cannot rest because rest means the grip loosens. They cannot trust because trust means delegating control. The compulsion to control is its own prison. Psychologist Roy Baumeister's research on ego depletion, the finding that self-control draws from a limited cognitive resource, shows that excessive reliance on willpower as a management strategy is unsustainable. Every act of forcible suppression, every deliberate override of impulse draws from a finite reserve. Over time, this leads to decision fatigue, emotional reactivity, and the collapse of the very control the person was trying to maintain. The Stoics proposed something different, not the absence of discipline. They were among the most disciplined individuals in recorded history. But a different kind of discipline, one that does not fight against the current of the mind, but works with its natural architecture. Marcus Aurelius described it this way: confine yourself to the present, not as a retreat from responsibility, as a precision instrument. When the mind is not fracturing its attention across imagined futures and regretted pasts, when it is fully present with what is actually occurring, it operates with a clarity and efficiency that effortful control can never produce. Flow states, described by psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi as the peak experience of full engagement, where effort and output merge into something that feels both effortless and highly effective, are neurologically characterized by a reduction in prefrontal activity in certain regions. The parts of the brain associated with self-monitoring, self-criticism, and deliberate control quiet down. The person is fully present, fully engaged, not managing their performance, but being it. You cannot force yourself into a flow state. You can only remove the obstacles that prevent it. This is the Stoic insight applied to human performance. The goal is not to impose control on the mind, but to remove the conditions that interfere with the mind's natural capacity for clarity and effective action. The paradox is real and measurable. When you stop gripping, the hand becomes more capable. So, what does this actually look like in practice? What is the daily architecture of someone who has genuinely internalized these principles? It does not look like someone who never gets angry. It looks like someone who notices anger arising and does not let it dictate their words before they have considered them. It does not look like someone who has no desires. It looks like someone who can pursue goals without becoming psychologically hostage to outcomes. It does not look like someone who is always calm. It looks like someone who can be present with discomfort without amplifying it into catastrophe. Let's build this architecture piece by piece. The foundation, morning clarity. The Stoics began each day with a practice of intentional reflection. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his journals before the demands of empire arrived. Seneca wrote letters to others, but functionally to himself, as a way of examining his principles before applying them to the day. Modern research on what's called implementation intentions, a concept developed by psychologist Peter Gallwitzer, shows that people who mentally simulate how they will handle anticipated challenges are significantly more likely to act in alignment with their values when those challenges arrive. The preparation itself changes the response. Each morning, before the noise of the day begins, ask 3 questions. What is likely to challenge my equanimity today? What is within my control and how I respond to it? What principle do I want to guide my behavior? This is not meditation in the traditional sense. It is cognitive rehearsal. It is training the prefrontal cortex to have a response ready before the amygdala fires. Between stimulus and response, that space Frankl identified, lives the most important skill you will ever develop. The practice is simple, not easy, simple. When something happens that produces a strong emotional reaction, do not respond immediately. Take 1 deliberate breath. Not because breathing is magical, because 1 deliberate breath takes approximately 4 seconds, which is precisely the time needed for prefrontal processing to engage after an amygdala response. You are literally giving your reasoning brain time to arrive at the situation before your reactive brain has already sent the email, said the thing, made the decision. This single practice, applied consistently, restructures the brain over time. Neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to reorganize itself in response to repeated patterns of activation, means that every time you successfully create the pause, you strengthen the neural pathway that supports it. You are physically building the architecture of equanimity into your brain. The Stoics ended each day with a practice of honest self-review. Seneca described it clearly. I examine my entire day and go back over what I've done and said, hiding nothing from myself, passing nothing by. This is not self-punishment. The goal is not to catalog failures and generate shame. The goal is accurate observation. Where did you act from principle? Where did you act from impulse? Where did the gap between stimulus and response close when it should have remained open? This practice does what journaling has been shown to do neurologically. It converts raw experience into processed memory. integrating emotional events into a coherent narrative. Research by psychologist James Pennebaker demonstrated that expressive writing about emotional experiences leads to measurable improvements in both psychological and physical health outcomes. The Stoics did not have Pennebaker's data, but they had millennia of lived results. Let's talk about the most powerful neurochemical in your life and why most people are spending it in ways that are quietly destroying their capacity for sustained satisfaction. Dopamine. Most people think dopamine is the pleasure chemical. This is a common misconception. Dopamine is more precisely described as the anticipation chemical. It drives motivation, seeking behavior, and the pursuit of reward. The dopamine hit comes not primarily from receiving something, but from expecting it. This distinction matters enormously. In a digital environment designed by behavioral engineers to maximize engagement, notifications, infinite scroll, variable reward schedules deliberately modeled on slot machine mechanics, the dopamine system is being activated at a frequency and intensity entirely mismatched with the system's evolutionary design. The result is not greater pleasure. It is a recalibrated reward threshold. When the brain is repeatedly flooded with rapid, low-effort dopamine hits, the baseline level of dopamine receptors available for slower, deeper, more meaningful rewards decreases. The activities that produce genuine satisfaction, deep work, meaningful relationships, physical mastery, creative accomplishment, start to feel effortful, dull, or inaccessible. You haven't lost the capacity for satisfaction. You've buried it under noise. The Stoics, writing in a world without smartphones, described the same dynamic in different language. Seneca wrote about the cost of luxuria, not luxury in the material sense, but the habit of seeking immediate gratification. He observed that people who pursue easy pleasure consistently find themselves less capable of the deeper satisfactions of virtue, meaningful work, and genuine connection. Modern neuroscience calls this dopamine downregulation. The Stoics called it the corruption of the soul. The mechanism is the same. Stoic discipline is, in part, a form of deliberate dopamine management, not through deprivation, through reorientation. By choosing to engage in activities that require delayed gratification, sustained effort, and tolerance of discomfort, you restore the brain's sensitivity to the rewards that actually produce lasting well-being. The Stoic practice of voluntary discomfort, deliberately doing without something comfortable, deliberately choosing difficulty when ease is available, was not asceticism for its own sake. It was neurological maintenance. It was keeping the reward system calibrated. Research on delayed gratification supports this connection. The famous Stanford marshmallow studies and subsequent research by psychologist Walter Mischel demonstrated that the capacity to delay gratification, to tolerate present discomfort in exchange for a more valued future outcome, is one of the strongest predictors of long-term well-being, academic achievement, and social competence. Discipline is not the enemy of enjoyment. It is the precondition for the kind of enjoyment that doesn't leave you empty immediately afterward. Here is something that rarely gets discussed in conversations about Stoicism. The quality of your relationships, the depth of your connections with other people, is directly shaped by your inner architecture. When your sense of stability is contingent on external validation, you bring a particular quality to every interaction, a quality of subtle measurement, of assessment, of checking beneath the surface whether this person approves of you, whether you are performing adequately, whether the interaction is confirming your worth. This is invisible to most people. They experience it as normal social anxiety, as caring what others think. but it fundamentally alters the nature of the interaction. Because when you are primarily monitoring for approval, you are not actually present. You are not listening. You are not engaging. You are managing. And people feel this, not consciously, but viscerally. There is a quality to a person who is genuinely present that is unmistakable, and it is rare. The Stoic practice of grounding your sense of worth in your own judgments, values, and actions, rather than in others' responses, does something remarkable to the social experience. When you are not seeking validation from an interaction, you can simply be in it. You can listen without preparing your next statement. You can disagree without anxiety. You can be uncertain without shame. You can offer your full attention because your attention is not divided between the conversation and the internal audit. Self-determination theory distinguishes between autonomous motivation, acting from genuine interest, values, or meaning, and controlled motivation, acting to obtain approval or avoid rejection. Research consistently shows that autonomously motivated relationships are characterized by greater authenticity, deeper connection, and higher mutual well-being. Marcus Aurelius captured the social dimension of Stoic practice in a line that carries remarkable weight. Begin the morning by saying to thyself, I shall meet with the busybody, the ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful, envious, unsocial. This might sound pessimistic. It is the opposite. By anticipating that other people will behave from their own conditioning, their own fears, their own limitations, rather than expecting perfect behavior and experiencing each disappointment as a personal affront, you move through the social world with a generosity that is only possible when you are not dependent on it giving you something. You can be kind to people who are not kind to you because your sense of equilibrium does not require their kindness. You can remain steady in conflict because your identity does not dissolve under challenge. This is what genuine social confidence looks like. Not performance, not dominance, simply the stability that comes from not needing the room to behave in a specific way in order for you to be okay. We are near the end of this video, and I want to speak to something that I think most self-improvement content avoids. The work we've discussed today, the pause, the observation, the daily reflection, the reorientation of desire, the dopamine discipline. This is not a quick fix. It does not produce dramatic, visible results in a weekend. What it produces is something far more valuable and far more durable. It produces character. And character, the Stoics believed, and the evidence of history confirms, is the only possession that cannot be taken from you. Marcus Aurelius lost children. He governed an empire in perpetual crisis. He lived through plague. He faced betrayal from people he trusted. He died, having never achieved the peace that was available to him, by some accounts, because the demands of his position made sustained practice difficult. And yet, the Meditations, a private journal never intended for publication, reveal a man who, in the midst of all of that, maintained a standard of inner engagement that 2,000 years later still reads as one of the most disciplined minds in recorded history. He didn't have extraordinary circumstances. He had an extraordinary relationship with his own mind. Epictetus was a slave. He had, in the most literal sense, no external freedom. And he produced a philosophy of freedom so rigorous and so complete that it shaped emperors, generals, and thinkers across centuries. He didn't achieve freedom through circumstances. He achieved it through understanding. This is the long game, not the rapid accumulation of productivity hacks and motivational peaks that fade by Thursday. The slow, patient, consistent building of an inner orientation that holds under pressure, under uncertainty, under the inevitable losses that a human life contains. The Stoics were not optimizing for peak performance. They were building something that would not break. Research in psychology on post-traumatic growth. The well-documented phenomenon where individuals who experience significant adversity often develop greater psychological strength, deeper relationships, and a clearer sense of meaning consistently identifies the same underlying factors. The capacity to find meaning in difficulty, a stable sense of identity that is not contingent on external conditions, and the ability to hold uncertainty without collapsing under it. These are not traits people are born with. They are built slowly, through practice, through the daily repetition of the principles we have covered today. Let me now give you the complete, integrated practice. 5 elements. Applied daily. 1. The morning inventory before the day begins. Sit with these 3 questions. What is likely to disturb my equanimity today? What is within my control? What principle guides me? Write the answers. The act of writing engages the prefrontal cortex and creates commitment through the process of articulation. 2. The pause practice. Every time a strong emotional reaction arises, create a 4-second pause before responding. Breathe. Name the emotion explicitly in your mind. This activates affect labeling, the neurological process that reduces amygdala reactivity and increases prefrontal engagement. Over time, this pause becomes the default. It becomes character. 3. The dichotomy check when anxiety, frustration, or craving arises. Ask immediately, is this about something within my control or outside it? If outside your control, redirect attention. If within your control, act. This single habit eliminates the vast majority of unnecessary suffering. 4. Dopamine hygiene. Identify your highest frequency dopamine sources: social media, news, food, entertainment. Wherever the easy hits come from, deliberately reduce or schedule them, not to punish yourself, to restore your brain's sensitivity to deeper satisfactions. This is maintenance, not deprivation. 5. The evening review. At the end of each day, spend 5 minutes in honest examination, not judgment, observation. Where did I act from values? Where did I act from impulse? What would a wiser version of me have done differently? No shame, no self-flagellation. Clear-eyed, honest assessment. Then close the journal. The day is done. Here is what I want you to take from everything we've covered today. You have been trying to fix something that was never broken. The discomfort you feel is not a malfunction. The desires that pull at you are not evidence of inadequacy. The thoughts that arise unbidden are not signs of weakness. They are the mind doing what minds do, responding to a complex world with all the tools evolution gave it, tools that were built for a different environment, operating in a radically transformed one. The Stoic path is not the path of suppression or indifference or the pretense that nothing affects you. It is the path of accurate perception, of seeing clearly, of knowing with increasing precision what is yours to work with and what is not. It is the path of the pause, the path of honest examination, the path of grounding your sense of worth not in the applause of the crowd, not in the next achievement, not in the absence of discomfort, but in the quality of your own attention, judgment, and response. Peace is not something you achieve. It is something you stop blocking. The Stoics spent their lives learning to get out of their own way, and that work, quiet, unglamorous, daily, is the most important work a human being can do. Save this video, come back to it when the noise gets loud. Come back to it when you find yourself gripping, forcing, striving for a calm that keeps slipping away. And remember, the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. The obstacle is not between you and peace. The obstacle is the path.